Good morning and welcome to the SCSA's Executive Series. And my name is Collin Pullar. I'm the president of the Saskatchewan Construction Safety Association. I'd like to welcome all of you who have signed in and are watching this either on Facebook Live or on Zoom. Again, our focus today, and the reason why we're calling this the Executive Series, is our focus is really on having discussion with owners, senior managers, and folks that are in those senior roles to get their perspective and insight on safety topics, but pertaining specifically to the leadership roles that they have in their business, regardless of the size of their organization. So if you are having trouble, by the way, connecting on Zoom, we're also running on Facebook Live, and there'll be a recording on there as well that you'll be able to follow up and watch as well later. As a bit of a background before I introduce our panel today, the SCSA, along with other partners, including WorkSafe, taking a particular focus on asbestos. So between over about an 8 to 10 year period between 2010 2018, about 37% of the fatalities that we've had in the province were from specifically occupational disease, which has been an upward trend. And in 2020 alone, of the 17 fatalities that we've seen in Saskatchewan, 6 are related to asbestos. So it is a growing concern. The vast majority, and perhaps we might be able to share some of this information later, but the vast majority of folks who are diagnosed and with mesothelioma, asbestos-related diseases, come from the construction industry, and so this is vitally important to our industry. And again, it's I thank you for all participating today. So we have a panel today that I'll introduce here. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Paul-Remi Poulin, who is manager with Saskatchewan Region Home Builders Association. I asked him if he can provide some introductory remarks on this topic. Paul.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to thank the SCSA for inviting the Saskatoon Region Home Builders Association to take part in this important webinar. We believe that asbestos awareness is an extremely important topic for our industry because, as we know, asbestos has been the cause for many lung-related diseases and fatalities in the construction industry, which we will speak more on later. But as many of our professional members continue to renovate and remodel older homes, it becomes very important that they have the right information and the right training when it comes to properly handling materials that might contain asbestos and further minimize the risks of exposure. And this type of asbestos awareness training also speaks to the value and importance, we believe, of being certified. Sorry about that. Of being certified, both as a certified home builder, but also in particular as a certified Renomark renovator, because of all the necessary standards that need to be placed on safe work practices within our industry. It's also important to note that the people, the employees, the companies who are affected by asbestos, really bear a pretty significant financial and moral burden. And so for all of these reasons that I mentioned, we as an association feel it's very important. And we see the importance in promoting and supporting proper education around this issue within the construction industry in general, but also in particular within the residential sector as well, and specifically within renovation. And so, again, thanks for having us join this webinar, and we are looking forward to continuing to expand our knowledge on this issue. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I really appreciate that, Paul-Remi. And I will, at this point, I will introduce members of our panel. First of all, I'll introduce Jason Hilderman, who is with Ministry of Labor Relations and Workplace Safety. He works specifically in the area of hygiene. David Kanciruk, who's the founder of Associated Asbestos Abatement, which is a division of Placecrete Systems, and it provides a range of services in the area of concrete restoration, bridge sealants, and hydrodemolition. And so I think in the future, if we have other topics, particularly things like silica exposure, we may call on Dave again if he'd be willing to speak to that. And Dave is based out of Regina. Finally, we'll have Dr. Paul Demers, who is trying to connect here, and just want to make sure that his he's able to, his volume is able to, or microphone is able to kick in. But Dr. Paul Demers, who is with the Occupational Cancer Research Center based in Ontario, and he will be one of our panelists as well. What I thought I would do, gentlemen, first of all, is if I could give you, 3 to 5 minutes just to kind of give your opening thoughts on this topic, and kind of, why is this important? And I'm sure each one of you have a bit of a personal story that you can speak to, but perhaps Jason, if I can, if I can kick it over to you to provide, kind of an introductory comment.
All right. So as a regulator, most of my comments will be based around the regulations and our interpretations of them and some of the guidance that we've provided. With asbestos still being relative thorn in our side, as a regulator, I'm seeing that there's still a lot of information that the general public needs to be aware of, and some of the newer businesses to be aware of. And the one of the big asbestos in it. With that being said, generally we're seeing most of the buildings built prior to the 90s kind of contain the majority of the asbestos, but we've had some situations, very rare, where there's has been asbestos installed after into the mid-2000s. So making sure that the appropriate testing's done before renovations is really key to this. I'm not sure what else you would like from me at this point. It's just I'm a little limited based on what I can speak about with basis of the regulations.
Thanks, Jason. No, I appreciate that. We'll have a number of different questions that'll pop up, and so we'll be bouncing a few off of you, Jason, and so appreciate you participating today. Dr. Demers is with us now, and Dr. Demers, thank you for your time participating here today. Really appreciate that. I wonder if you could take a few minutes here, 3 to 5 minutes, say, and if you've got some opening thoughts, and the format today will be we'll get some opening thoughts, and then we'll dive into a few questions right after that.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I'm happy to be here. Sorry, it took me a little while to get connected in. I'm not sure what happened. So for those of you who don't know me, I direct a cancer research center based in Toronto that's really focused in on workplace cancer. We do a lot of research in the area of asbestos. It's always kind of a little bit of an odd thing for me, because when I entered the field of occupational health back in, it might be the late 70s, I'm sorry, but it's a long time ago, and I thought that asbestos was an old issue back then. I never suspected that 40 years later it would still be a major area for us. So I think that that's a bit of a, it still is amazing to me how much we're doing in this area. Our center focuses a lot on asbestos, and particularly trying to identify the impact of asbestos, how many cases of cancer and other types of lung disease are being caused. Our numbers are the ones that are often, whenever you hear anything from the federal government when they were doing the ban, and they would say, well, how many cancers are caused by asbestos? What's the economic costs? Those were things that came out of research that was coordinated by our center. We also try to identify different groups that have the highest risk of asbestos related disease. And we're also trying to look at different areas of prevention. We're trying to also track where mesothelioma rates are going in the country. Anyway, I'm happy to talk about any of that today as we're here. So again, I'm happy to be here and to join this panel.
Great, thank you, Dr. Demers, and finally, David Kanciruk, again, is our local to Regina and the province. Has been very active within the construction industry for a number of years, including I believe a few terms with the Construction Association, and has been a recognized leader in the industry. And so really appreciate you joining us, David. Your initial thoughts, and perhaps you can kind of talk about a little bit of how and why you've gotten involved in the kind of line of work that you do.
Thanks, Colin. Just to start off here, I've been involved in the construction industry since 1974, so I've been around a long time. I've worked a lot of different industries. And in 2004, I had the opportunity to get involved with Associated Asbestos Abatement as an owner, and took advantage of it. And I really thought that this was going to be a quick end. I thought we would be done by by 2015. This was a 10-year plan for me that I was going to be in and out. Well, unfortunately, it's still going strong. The asbestos is not a nice material to work with. It was great for what it did. Unfortunately, it kills people. And I have personally had a good friend of mine died of mesothelioma. I personally have a claim registered with with workers' compensation, because I was exposed to asbestos in a workplace that was supposedly clean and was determined later to be asbestos containing. I think we should be doing a lot more to inform the general public of the concerns of asbestos, and not to scare them, but to make them aware. Especially what we're seeing right now is in the home industry. I get a lot of calls and people ask me, well, what should I do? And I said, well, I really can't tell you what to do in your own home, but here's what can happen. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of people who are selling people a line that they shouldn't be following. Asbestos is in a lot of products, especially in the residential end. I mean, from drywall to flooring to insulation to whatever, and it needs to be addressed. In the commercial side, it is pretty well known by all contractors, mechanical, general, electrical, flooring contractors. Everybody is pretty much aware of the dangers of it and how to deal with it. The big concerns right now, I feel, are in the residential side.
Thanks, David, and thanks for sharing that that personal part of the story about your own exposure. And I think it's really important to share with others that this is a live risk and a live hazard for so many of us. Just on the topic of building materials and that you just touched on, and perhaps maybe I can even start with you, Dr. Demers, in terms of you did a recent presentation in Regina a few months ago, probably about 7 or 8 months ago, I suspect, where you talked a bit about this. But I thought too that asbestos was something that was kind of maybe in really old buildings, really old homes. But Are there newer buildings? Are materials in newer buildings, do they still contain asbestos? Is it even legal to do this? And what kind of products would contain asbestos from the research that you've done? Oh, you're still on mute, Dr. Mears.
I would say not anymore in terms of brand new buildings, but even a few years ago, I was hearing from different people in construction downtown that in Toronto that there was still asbestos pipe going in to buildings. So those are probably asbestos containing cement were pipes and some panels and things are probably about the last things that I'm aware of that were still being used in construction recently in Canada. Of course, all that's stopped now. At least we certainly hope so. It certainly wouldn't be legal. There are still a few things that have gotten exemptions from the ban, at least in the short term. But they don't deal with construction. They deal with the chlor-alkali industry, reusing tailings, things like that. So I think we're in good shape now. But that said, certainly so many of our buildings were built during a period where there was widespread use of asbestos in a lot of different products. Certainly, I hear about this all the time in things like schools, where although I agree, the biggest challenges to me would probably be in residential because each house would be its own separate problem. And supposedly, at least in a lot of our schools, there should be programs in place to identify asbestos. And yet I still hear about issues coming up even in schools. And certainly most of the schools that I know of are of an age where there was a substantial amount of asbestos put into them. The same thing's true for hospitals and places like that. So I don't think it's a problem that's going away anytime soon. The ban is going to help us in the decades coming forward. But right now it makes it's a very important step. I don't want to downplay it too much. It was an important step to take, but its impact is going to be felt in decades to come. Right now we're dealing with practices in the past.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. And Dave, just bridging off of that, I mean, we're primarily, both of you have spoken so far about renovation, perhaps on the demolition side, and Paul-Remi mentioned this as well. But if, from your experience, I mean, people who are even renovating their own home are certainly at risk. And what kind of, how does somebody even know if they've got asbestos in either their residence or their building? Is there a rule of thumb to know, or how do they get a test? How does this work in your industry, Dave?
Well, and I'll just back that up a little bit. I would say in 95% of the commercial and institutional buildings, they're required by law to have surveys done and on a yearly basis, they're supposed to update, and Jason can back me up on this, update on what they have as an asbestos inventory within their building. So they're supposed to know. Residentially, people don't know. So often they'll get on the internet and they'll start to look around and start to explore what products may have contained. And that's the issue. I mean, we see asbestos coming in sheet flooring, in vinyl asbestos tile, in ceiling tile, in drywall, in zonalite insulation. I mean, so it comes in various forms. And also on the electrical side, if we go back farther, in the old knob and tube system, there was asbestos involved with that on the electrical side. We see it on a lot of older homes and boilers, on the piping from the boilers for their heating systems. In a lot of cases too, you see it around, it used to be around fireplaces, heating systems, all had it. So it's in a variety of products. And really the only way that a homeowner would know if they have asbestos is to have an environmental company come in, an environmental consulting company come in and do a survey on their house. And that is the only true way you would know. I mean, you really can't identify asbestos by looking at it. You can make an educated guess, but that's all you're doing.
Okay, Jason, to that point, and just as David talked about the regulations around existing commercial buildings, and could you talk a little bit about that and what the law speaks to in that regard?
Yeah. So every every employer has the duty to identify asbestos-containing materials at their workplace. So pretty much all commercial buildings, industrial buildings, anybody that falls underneath the occupational health and safety regulations has the duty to provide this identification. And if a material is not identified as asbestos containing through testing, it's assumed to be asbestos containing until otherwise proven through testing. In addition to that, we do have the Saskatchewan Asbestos Registry that all public buildings are supposed to publish their surveys on and update their annual inventory audit. And that is actually accessible to the public through saskatchewan.ca under the Asbestos Registry. And as Dave said too, the commercial buildings also have to do a audit yearly, and this will look at the condition of the asbestos that is remaining. And any time that asbestos is removed or repaired, it should be updated in their list of asbestos-containing materials for the workplace.
Okay, well, in terms of responsibility, and we've had a couple of questions, both in the pre, and I think we have a question in the that has been submitted here while we're online, is regarding to who's legally responsible in terms of controlling and identifying the asbestos. Is it the owner of the building? Is it the contractor who's doing work? If there's a prime contractor, who's responsible for the due diligence in this regard and informing, their trades or sub-trades, what's, the situation and maybe Dave, sorry, Jason, I'll start off with you and then I'll go to Dave for his thoughts on that.
Sure. So as you are probably aware, the occupational health and safety regulations focus on the employer-employee relationship. So it's pretty easy if a business operates at one building and they own their own building, that employer is responsible for doing that asbestos assessment, not ensuring that the asbestos assessment is completed for that building, then having a written record of it for the employees to refer to and then continually updating it. The problem is we get in different industries where the workplace is changing, whether it's contract jobs going from place to place to place, that's where the employer needs to be on top of it to ensure that their employees or workers are protected while doing their job. So they should be tracking down that information, and that would be between the employer and the owner of the building to determine who wants to be paying for that assessment, or if that assessment's already done, retrieving that information from the employer or from the owner, sorry.
Great. And Dave, perhaps you can, if you wanted to add to that, but even the thoughts on, who's responsible for informing once, say once the contractor is aware of this, informing, other subcontractors if they're the prime or vice versa.
Well, the ultimate responsibility falls upon the building owner to make sure that he knows what is in his building. The problem that we see is that a lot of building owners don't know what they have. So what we see often in the tendering process is that there'll be the consultants will come and prepare drawings and whatever, and they don't see so they don't take the responsibility upon themselves to actually go out and get a survey. They feel it's not their responsibility. And they leave the responsibility to the prime contractor, general contractor, and subtrades, who do a very good job of protecting their workers. Everybody is in the commercial side and industrial side of the building industry. The contractors do a very good job, I feel, in protecting their workers. The workers are very aware of possible asbestos-containing products. The problem that I see is the consultants, whether they be the architecture, the electrical, mechanical, or whatever consultant that may be involved, are failing to do their job and having surveys done.
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, obviously that has a tremendous impact on the outcomes of you know, in terms of not exposures from newly installed product, because that we've just talked about that a few minutes ago, but certainly again in the renovation side. And I mentioned at the opening that we've had a good third, if not a higher ratio than that, of the fatalities in our industry are directly associated with this particular product. And it has, you know, unfortunately, there's a latency period. And I wonder, Dr. Demers, if you could speak to a bit of that, and even the process. How does one get diagnosed with it? And you know, are there other factors that people should be considering in terms of things like other lifestyle things, like whether it be smoking or those kinds of things that could have impact as well on that? I realize it's kind of a really broad question, but but would you be able to speak to some of that, and then we'll kind of get the thoughts from other people around the table.
Well, certainly it takes most of the diseases associated with asbestos, or all the diseases, unless you're extremely highly exposed, would take a very long time to show up. Decades later is typical, sometimes many decades later in the case of mesothelioma. One important thing is always to make sure that your healthcare provider knows that you've been exposed to asbestos, because it really the first line at which things are recognized is when is at a physician's office usually, or in your primary healthcare, and then they can refer you on. But letting them know that you've been exposed is the important piece there, to make sure that in fact they know what to be paying attention for. There's lots of different symptoms associated with respiratory cancer, shortness of breath, and many other things. But I mean, I was looking at them this morning. The kind of overlap with COVID. I mean, they're not that specific, but if your physician knew, for instance, that you've been exposed in the past to asbestos, that certainly helps in making sure you get referred. Unlike some other cancers like colon cancer or breast cancer, there isn't screening for mesothelioma. Right now, the feeling among people who do screening is that basically there's no effective screening because we couldn't identify it in an early enough time to make a difference to save people. So it really is something where we don't have advanced screening there. On the other hand, lung cancer screening is now being pilot tested in some different areas in Canada, certainly in the United States and other countries as well. Now, the initial target for those lung cancer screening programs is heavy smokers. But if somebody smoked a lot in the past and was exposed to asbestos, they're at extremely high risk for lung cancer. So you might be able to qualify for lung cancer screening when that comes online. And that has proven effective in saving lives. So we can hope that comes in more widely across the country now. But I know it's the initial pilot tests being done in Ontario were looking very good in terms of bringing it in here. So I hope that that's going to be true across the country. But we don't, smoking does continue to be a very big cofactor for lung cancer. It's not a factor in terms of mesothelioma or asbestosis, but really the most common, although mesothelioma gets all the attention because it's very clear and it's very specific to asbestos or things that are very much like asbestos. It is probably the single biggest cause of death for people who are exposed to asbestos is actually lung cancer. There are many lung cancers for every mesothelioma that was diagnosed. So we do want to make sure, it is a strong recommendation that if you were exposed to asbestos in the past, it becomes even more important to quit smoking.
Okay. Just, and I believe this was from a presentation that you had provided earlier that I had attended, but could you comment on both the cost and the time frame from some, you'd made a reference to the time frame between diagnosis and perhaps somebody passing from, and I believe it was mesothelioma, but please correct me if I'm incorrect there. And it was a very short period.
Well, there's research going on. It's fairly rare for somebody to be diagnosed with mesothelioma at a young age. Most people these days, certainly the majority of cases in Canada are being diagnosed among people over the age of 70. And the fastest growing age group for people to be diagnosed with mesothelioma is actually over the age of 80. So it is something that is hitting people much later in life now. Part of that may be that lower levels of exposure might mean that it takes longer to develop. We think that may be the case. It's hard to prove that, but it's something that we're trying to look at in our research. But then there are these cases amongst people who, where we don't know, they're not old enough to have been exposed many decades in the past. And it's a question of whether or not they may have been exposed as children or other things. But that certainly is an area that remains an area of ongoing research. But it is a hard one for people to do because there's simply not that many cases around to be able to interview and really get the detailed information on their history of exposure.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I'll kind of ask the same question, but I'll probably make it a little more maybe closer to home in some respects, in the sense that I mean, and I know people that have been diagnosed and passed away from mesothelioma or other asbestos-related disease, and but there's also a lot of that has been associated with the residential renovation work, as you talked about earlier, but also exposure to family members who are fairly young, who may live in that same residence as work is ongoing. Could you speak to any of that, Dave, and your experience in seeing that?
Well, yeah, I can, and I'll kind of relate this back to some of my own personal experiences. I mean, having worked as a carpenter in the construction industry, I'll tell you a story about a grocery store that I was working for, a general contractor in the 80s. We were doing major renovations, and as you know, grocery stores don't shut down. We were doing in this work, the plumber had to make a connection at the main sewer line, which what we found out later was cement transite pipe. He came in early in the morning. We were all there at 4 o'clock in the morning. He takes a quickie saw, cuts through this pipe, and there was dust all over the place. And being that this was asbestos fibers in transite pipe, the asbestos is fairly high, but it's non-friable. So what he did was the worst thing that you could do. He cut it. And these fibers were all over the store. Now, the cans and everything were filthy. So the store manager sent his staff around with feather dusters going around to clean this whole mess up. every one of those people in that store were exposed. And because nobody knew anything about it at that time, or information was limited, they took their dirty clothes home with them, took them off wherever the fibers were released, wherever they went, because they were in their clothes. And this is from my personal experience.
Wow. Yeah. So the impacts could be, it's like putting throwing a rock into a pond, and it can really expand quickly.
Absolutely.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Just a question. You mentioned earlier about about having a survey done or those kinds. But if somebody's working on their home or wherever, how easy is it to get someone to come and do some testing before somebody starts work? And I mean, I from personal experience, I know owners who don't know where they're supposed to start. They've seen something on television that says, knock out this wall and you can have a beautiful home, and so they get their sledgehammer and they start knocking out walls. But in a very practical level, and actually there's a similar question here I see in our chat. Considering what we mentioned before about owners not knowing or taking necessary steps to become informed, how practical and readily available is testing for asbestos in existing buildings?
I'll jump in. And testing is readily available. I think the biggest thing that most people have to be concerned about is the age of your building, the age of your house. If your house was built basically from the mid-50s up until 1984, 1985, you should be aware that you may have asbestos in various materials within your house. And I said 1955 because of my experience within Saskatchewan. Most houses before that were plaster, and we rarely see it in plaster in houses. That's not to say that it doesn't happen, but it is more rare than in drywall. And it's not in the drywall itself, it's in the compound.
Okay.
So it's in the mud. And testing is readily available, but it's expensive. And that's one of the things most homeowners or most people don't want to spend the extra money to get that testing, that survey done, where a consultant would come in, take various samples of various materials in your house if possible, and have them tested for asbestos.
Okay. But it's still strongly recommended.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and Jason can comment on that. Jason would probably a good person to talk to you about that, because he did work in the testing industry as well. And I mean, he's very familiar with what has to happen.
Yeah. Does somebody have to actually, like, if they find asbestos in their house, do they have to go and get a full abatement, or or can they get things encapsulated? Is that, what's the best practice around that? Is encapsulation still considered a good practice, or what are some of the practices in other provinces around this? If you could maybe give your thoughts on that, David and or Jason, if either one of you could respond to that.
Jason, do you want to start?
Sure. I just want to touch back on Dave's comments. Yeah, actually, he is quite correct. A lot of the older plaster actually contained horsehair as a binding agent, not asbestos. But the one thing that I would like to add to Dave's comments is buildings even built prior to the 50s, we also got to remember that there was a time of renovation during those buildings that if they're still standing since then, that they could have gone through, where asbestos materials could have been added, especially if you started off with a wood-fired heating system and then got converted over to a boiler system in the prime time that asbestos was used on mechanical insulation. Also, in our testing experience that I've had in the previous, I used to actually be a consultant for about a decade. I was privy to find out the exact age of buildings, and then we had a database to base when we were finding certain materials containing asbestos in those buildings. And some of those buildings we were finding were built as new as in the 90s, and actually last year I found one building that was built in the mid 2000s here, early 2000s, that actually had vermiculite asbestos containing insulation installed. And what we're seeing is the reason behind that is that somewhere out there, there are still a few stockpiles of asbestos containing materials that have either been unintentionally or intentionally installed in the buildings to get rid of those stockpiles. The question, sorry, what was your last question there? I kind of got off topic, but I just wanted to make sure I clarified the first part up there.
It was really kind of connected to the encapsulation. You know, can somebody seal this? Do they have to go and do a complete abatement? You know, if someone's doing a floor or something like that, is there a way to seal that so they don't have to go through the expense necessarily of a full abatement?
Sure. Coming from the regulatory side, what we're looking at is if asbestos is being disturbed, it has to be controlled so that there's no fibers being released and the workers are protected. In addition to that, all asbestos surfaces have to be kept in good condition. Now, there are definitely some pros and cons to removal, encapsulation, and management. Essentially, removal is probably the most expensive upfront, but it gets rid of the problem. The encapsulation, a little bit cheaper, but you still have that asbestos in your building and will require maintenance. Dave has probably got a little more experience with being able to provide insight on costs and maintenance of that. Maybe I'll let you take that one, Dave.
Sure. What we have to realize in Collin's questions is there's basically three types of asbestos removal. There's a low risk, a high risk, and a medium risk. And a lot of the products within your commercial areas, or pardon me, in your residential areas, are considered a low risk. And those being, in fact, like 9x9, 12x12 tile, drywall is a low risk. So those are the two that the homeowner would probably run into. We very seldom see a moderate risk in a residential side unless it comes into where they're doing some fitting, asbestos fitting removal, which we would use a glove bag operation. The high risk is quite common in residential because the zonolite insulation, vermiculite type of insulation, was used a lot in attics. So we encounter that a lot. And we see a lot in sheet flooring, which is also considered a high risk. And those are your costly items. The key with asbestos is disturbance. If you're not disturbing the asbestos and raising fibers, your concern, you should have no concern in there. As a person living in a house that may contain zonolite, as long as I'm not disturbing it, there is no chance of fiber release. And the same with sheet flooring. The danger is when I'm renovating, am I going to take that sheet flooring out? Or do I cover over top of it, which I can do? Will the flooring contractor, and the flooring contractors now are pretty wise as well too, they're saying, well, you know what? We don't want to even go over top of it. It's your responsibility to take it out. And that's where the costs come in. I mean, it's an expensive venture. We have to set the house up as a high risk. The whole place gets put under negative air pressure. The guys have to shower in and out, and it means the homeowner will have to be out of the house for a while. So, and that's when Jason comes in with the regulations, because we have to notify them of a high risk removal process.
Great. Thank you. In terms of the regulations themselves and other support material on this, um, you know, are they easy to find, Jason? Where would a person refer to in the regs around on the topic of asbestos?
Well, I'm a little biased because I'll say they're easy to find, but then again, I look at them every day. So, there's several good resources out there. The first one will go right to the regulations. So the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations of 1996 is available on the Saskatchewan.ca website. I believe there is a PDF version you can download, or you can order the actual regulations through the Queen's printer. And the regulations pertaining for asbestos do start at Regulation 330, and they actually go to 345. There are some other regulations that do tie into it, especially with concerning around respiratory protection. And so that's where business employers will want to definitely pay attention to, and employees. The other resources that we do have out there are the Saskatchewan Asbestos Abatement Manual, which is a guideline for abating asbestos. I believe there is also another guide out there for managing asbestos in buildings. In addition to that, there's some pretty good information if we look to our neighbors in the prairies here for what they're doing with asbestos. But in terms of regulations, yeah, we go straight to the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations in 1996.
Great. Thanks, Jason. I'll just do a little quick commercial thing. If you've got the mobile, the OHS, SCSA OHS mobile app, you will also get a topic on asbestos, and it gives you a quick link to the legislation that Jason was referring to. So I encourage you, if you don't have this already on your mobile device, to please search for that. You could find it very easily in the app or Google Play Store, and just type SCSA OHS, and you should be able to download that. Again, asbestos, one of the topics in there. Just seeing our time is quickly moving away, and I unfortunately haven't been able to get to, I think, half the questions that were pre-submitted. There is, so you know, there'll be a survey that'll be popping up either in your chat or a little bit later to ask you to provide some information to us, because we wanted to know, you know, what else do you need to know and want to know about asbestos? You know, is it a topic of a situation where we need, you know, more tools or information or links to information? And we also want to do a bit of a consultation with the broader industry on what's needed. You know, in our industry, Dave talked earlier about making sure that the general public was aware of these risks, and you know, and I assume at certain points that somebody who's going to go and tear down a wall might want to consult a professional before they start doing that. But before we close out, though, I would love if each one of you could kind of give us your closing thoughts on this, and any critical messages that you wanted to share before we close today, because again, we weren't able to get to a lot of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. But Paul, perhaps if we can, I'm sorry, Dr. Demers, if we could start with you.
You can call me Paul. Everybody else does. I don't know if I have a lot to add. You know, it is. I know that a lot of folks felt like when the ban came in that suddenly asbestos was being dealt with. What I had hoped would come from the ban was simply a lot more awareness that this is a problem that's going to be with us for a long time. And it's a continual challenge, I think, to keep this as a fresh health and safety issue for people in all areas of construction, where there's so many occasions when you're working with a pre-existing building where you can encounter asbestos. If you're not always kind of have it in the back of your mind that when in doubt, assume it is asbestos, or as was mentioned earlier. So I think it is something that's going to be with us for a long time, and certainly the health effects are going to be with us for a long time. And it makes it a problem because we can't really, measure the, when you do something to prevent injuries, you get an immediate impact on reduced injuries. When you do something to prevent asbestos exposure, you see the benefits decades in the future. It makes it a challenge, I think, in terms of pushing prevention and pushing actually the spending money on prevention that we need to do. But it's something that we do need to continue to do.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Demers. If anyone wanted to find out more information on the Occupational Cancer Research Center, can they just do a Google search and find that to get your website if you've got
yeah,
data?
occupationalcancer.ca. It's pretty easy.
Okay.
So it should come up pretty easy on any kind of a search.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Jason. Any final thoughts before we close out today?
Just stressing that asbestos awareness out there. As a regulator, I'm still doing a lot of inspections and still finding a lot of employers not aware of their requirement to identify asbestos-containing materials for their workers. And then, in addition to some of the employers that actually do get that assessment done, is the duty to ensure that the materials are being re-inspected yearly and keeping those asbestos surfaces in good condition. So really want to push out that if you think your building is built at a time when asbestos was used, maybe start getting those asbestos surveys done, call around, get some quotes in. The biggest thing, like everybody's saying, is prevention to the exposure, because we're not going to see the results of it right away. It's down the road. And I am seeing, though, on my end of things, that there has been an increase in awareness of the asbestos out there, and we just need to keep the ball rolling, and hopefully everybody will soon know the risks of asbestos and where to find them.
Thank you. Appreciate that. David, your thoughts.
Well, I'd like to agree with both Jason and Dr. Demers. I think what they've said is very true. Asbestos isn't going to kill you today, but it may tomorrow. And I really want to emphasize that as a person who is in the asbestos field, keeping your employees safe is the #1 outmost goal that you should have as an employer. And exposing them to asbestos is a horrible thing to do. Having said that, I would also like to see our regulations in Saskatchewan tightened up. I think we could be doing a better job in that. And I know it's going to take some time and work, and I know there is a lot of work being done, and there has been a lot of work being done in the past as well. But I think our regulations have to get tighter. There's still a lot of people out there who feel asbestos isn't going to affect them. It may not affect them, may affect their family. And I think that's the one word that you have to be really concerned about is, just because I've been exposed to asbestos doesn't mean I'm going to get an asbestos-linked cancer or mesothelioma, but my family may. And I think that's the one word that you should always take out there, going to affect somebody.
Great. Okay, thank you, David. Paul-Remi, would you like to kind of close this out? I'll have a couple quick comments after you speak, but
sure. Yeah. I mean, I mean, the experts really have provided the detailed information on it, and so I'm not going to speak a whole lot on the issue itself. But what I do want to say in closing is just that there were mentions that the residential area, the residential sector, in terms of employers and renovators, there's still some obviously some work to be done in terms of the awareness. And I think that's one of the things that our association is continuing to focus on, is providing some of that continued training, continued safety, education to our members, to those companies who are doing those renovations, especially in the older homes. Excuse me, so that they are better equipped to to deal with any exposure or any asbestos that is in place. And so I think that is certainly one big portion of it. But I think, as everyone has mentioned, the educating of the consumer or the public is also another big portion. So I think, again, there's still some work to do, but we are on the right track. So
Okay.
my son is just trying to train us all on asbestos as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thanks, Paul-Remi. I thank each one of our panelists today, Dr. Demers, Dave Kanciruk, Jason Hilderman, and Paul-Remi Poulin from the Saskatoon Region Home Builders Association. We're hoping this will be the first of several conversations on this particular topic. And so I ask you to watch for things on social media, some communications that may go out in the not too distant future on this, as well as invite you again to participate in survey questions or offer your own suggestions on things we can do as an industry in terms of education, training, informing the public, those elements. And over the next coming weeks and months, even as we work through a very top of mind hazard being COVID-19, that we have this at the front of our minds as well, because it has been something that's taken a significant number of lives in our province. And there's certainly an opportunity for us to change that curve. And so again, I thank each one of you for participating. Again, this will be recorded and available on Facebook Live for anyone who may have missed this and you wanted to share this information. Please do. I apologize we weren't able to get to every question that people had, but there were some great ones, and I thank you so much. Again, thank to each one of our panelists. And with that, we'll be signing off. And as soon as Rick hangs up this call, we're going to be disconnected from all our panelists. So thank you. I just want to say, have a great day. Really appreciate you.